having spent a lot of time looking at nutrition, I think a lot about nutrition, obviously the impact that that has on the gut. Then if the gut is involved in emotion, in communicating with the brain, I was looking at the modern world going, okay, our diets are just absolute tragedies.
Yeah.
We no longer have to exercise to survive. So now exercise becomes completely optional. Modern life, especially with social media, is pushing people into isolation. Even if you're around people, you're emotionally distant, you're emotionally isolated. And so you start putting all of that together and everything just deranges just enough that especially if you're already predisposed to this because of childhood trauma, now you're way out of whack. But only some of that I would liken to control, like diet. That's to me sort of a bodily communication. That's microbes that are sort of derailing. Or you may also, and this part, I don't even have another person that has said something along these lines that makes me think this. But when I think about mitochondria, mitochondrial dysfunction, if there's any sort, I mean, there has to be signaling of some kind. So it's like, where are we picking up on that signaling? Is that also part of the body telling us that there's a problem? And if your diet's off, you're going to feel it in the gut and in the mitochondria. So do you think any of that played into pre-COVID and then COVID just exacerbates it with control? Or is depression really just you feel out of control? That's the pattern. And when you have it, you're in real trouble.
I mean, and that gets back to the statement I said earlier around, there are probably multiple things that kind of get lumped into depression, right? Not everyone, some people kind of are in an over control phenomenon, so it's not everybody necessarily has this, has a kind of a perceived loss of control necessarily, right? And that may be more of a problem of us being kind of lumpers instead of splitters on the diagnosis. But to your question, I mean, what's hard about understanding any psychiatric condition is that you need to establish some level of causality, right? And so the reason why psychiatry is over here, neurology is over here, is because in neurology, the game is where's the lesion, and in psychiatry, historically, there is no lesion, right? There's no kind of lesion that we can pick up on standard imaging methodologies that are employed for
because the dysfunction just isn't tied to a lesion.
Well, it's electrical, effectively. So what we think about as a lesion really ends up being, in the case of that paper I talked about earlier, flipping of the signaling directionality. It functions kind of like a lesion. So if you take people that have depression from a stroke and you look at where all of those strokes fell on a common brain atlas, like functional atlas, Mike Fox and others at Harvard found that brain lesions that are functionally connected to that same control region are associated with depression, and brain lesions that don't fall within a network that's connected to that control region don't have, those individuals.
So if I had a stroke and you looked at it, you would determine by the region of the brain that I had the stroke in whether I'm now at higher risk for a stroke-related depression or not.
Yeah, so I think they're doing those prospectively now, but in a retrospective way, at a group level, you can put all those lesions on the brain, and the vast majority of them would, if you had depression from stroke, would be functionally connected to that same control region. And so, it looks like a lot of what we think about as depression ends up being, that sort of a problem. But to your point, right, it's a complicated thing, right? If you stimulate on the vagus nerve in the neck, you can produce signals up into the brain and treat depression, right? And there's a huge Medicare funded study going on right now to start paying for something like that, where you actually stimulate a cranial nerve, that also propagates down to the gut, propagates to the heart, and if you stimulate and go up, it'll affect those same core brain regions